Hey everyone, welcome to Buick Outdoors. If you're new around here, my name is Sheldon Marion, and today I'm going to be going over some of the 5 best calibers for bears. So starting this thing off here, I have a pretty wide range of calibers here today. Uh, Pretty well, I'm starting on the small end. I'm going small, medium, large, shotgun, and then lever action. And to start things off, what I have for one of the small calibers is this little guy here. This is a 243 Win Mag. It's loaded with 100 grain partition bullets. The 243, it is a fairly small and fairly light round. With this, it's pretty comparable to like a 7mm 08. And for small calibers, the 243, 7mm 08, or the 308 are all amazing calibers, especially if you're a young shooter or some females, they can't handle the bigger calibers. So something like this works great. What it comes down to pretty well with almost any caliber is your bullet selection. And with the 243 especially, the nozzle partition is kind of my go-to for the 243. Uh, the way that the partition is built is this top half. It's kind of like a soft lead that's just kind of coated in copper with a little nickel on it. And at the tip here, you have this really soft lead point. And then the bottom half is pretty well like a solid core kind of a thing. So what happens is when this bullet makes contact, this lead goes inside and it starts to expand right away. And then the bottom half, seeing how it's pretty well almost solid, it's still lead, but it's separated by like a plate of copper kind of a thing in the middle. And what that does is that it gives you enough kind of force and momentum to keep pushing through. It doesn't just mushroom out and all the energy is expelled right away. So this partition, it hits, it opens up really fast, and you get a good little burst of energy and a wound cavity. And then the bottom half, it because it's solid, it kind of keep pushing. So when it kind of forces the light small bullet all the way through. And when it comes to things like the 243, 7mm 08, 308, you really need that extra little push to get through something like a bear. Any like kind of deep cavity animals, bear, uh, buffalo, moose kind of thing. I would not use this on a buffalo, but it's those types of animals. Especially with bears, they have extremely thick skin. They have really long hair, and they don't really leave much of a blood trail. So with the 243, it's on the lighter end, but it can work. Again, though, shot placement, bullet selection, they all make a huge part of you being able to recover that bear. So with the 243, it's not my go-to, but it's one that I've used. And again, just bullet selection, shot placement, and just with the 243, you might want to be ready for a follow-up shot. But with that all being said, it's still a good round, especially for kids and, like I said, women who can't handle recoil, or even some of the men out there, they just don't like the heavy recoil. So something like a 243 or 308, absolutely perfect rounds, and they'll get the job done. With the 243, the ballistics, they're not overly too impressive. With this one here, 100 grain nozzle partition. The velocity at the muzzle is 2,850 feet per second. At 100 yards, it's 2,600. At 200 yards, 23. And then after that, I'm not even gonna list it off because this is not a past 200-yard gun, especially on something like bears, because they're so tough and their hide's thick, and it's just, you don't want to go past. For me, this is 150-yard and under caliber. The energy at the muzzle is 1,800. At 100 yards, it's 1,500, and at 200 yards, it's 1,200. So even at 1200 yards, there is still a little bit of energy coming out of it. However, with that thick skin of a bear, it's you might not get a full pass through, and that's pretty troublesome when it comes to bears because they don't leave much of a blood trail. Plus, with this bullet being so thin, it doesn't make a big wound cavity. So, the chances of a bear getting away on you using this round, it's up there. However, like I said, it can be done under certain circumstances and at certain ranges with the proper bullets. So, that being said, we'll move on to our next one. So, our next one here is it falls into like the medium size ones. Uh, and for me, I'd say the medium size is kind of like your 270s, your 280s, your 30-06s. And that's exactly what this one here is a 30-06 Springfield. Uh, these have been around for generations. It's got to be one of the most popular rounds there is. With this one here, because it's a 30 caliber, the amount of bullet selection that you have for this is just tremendous. You can get 100 grain up to 220 grain, I believe. And what this one here is loaded with is 200 grain trophy bonded bear claws. And with these trophy bonded bear claws, they're almost identical to a nozzler partition. How it's separated from about halfway. The top is pretty well lead with a small coating of copper, and then there's like a coating of nickel on the outside. And then the bottom half, instead of having like a lead core that's kind of surrounded by copper, like the nozzle partition, this one here, the bottom half is just straight copper. With these ones here, they say that it'll have a 95% weight retention. So it's fairly identical to a nozzler partition, where as soon as that bullet makes contact, that lead instantly opens up really fast, so you get a really good initial wound cavity, and then that copper on the inside really drives it all the way through. And with this one here, being 200 grains, the kick from this gun, you will feel it a bit when you pull the trigger because it's such a heavy bullet that it takes so much pressure to kind of drive it down the barrel. So all that forward momentum, it's also going to come back. So you might feel it a little bit in your shoulder. However, it is devastating on bears. The ballistics on this one here, the velocity at the muzzle is 2,600 feet per second. At 100 yards, it's 2,300. 200 yards, 21. And 300 yards is 1,900. And the energy is actually fairly similar to a 300 Win Mag. The energy at the muzzle is 3,375 foot-pounds. At 100 yards, it's 2,700. At 200 yards, it's 2,200. And at 300 yards, it's 1,700. And then also the drop in inches, it really isn't that bad. So if you zero this out at 100 yards, at 200 yards, you're going to drop basically 5 inches. And at 300 yards, you're going to drop 17 inches. So it's really, it's fairly comparable to a 300 Win Mag. And it's a 30-06. And with this one here, I've taken 2 bears with this one now. And each one pretty well shot them kind of on the pipeline eating grass. They ran about maybe 50 yards in the bush and just up right there. And, there was no follow-up shots on either one of the bears. But that was also because of shot placement. It was a double lung, straight pass-through shot. So, yeah, it worked absolutely, great for me. So with that being said, what we're going to do is we're going to move on to one of our larger calibers. Now this one here, this is kind of the king of 30 calibers, really. This is the 300 Win Mag. With this one, The 300 Win Mag, I usually shoot 180 grain partitions, but seeing how there's a bit of an ammo shortage and it was really hard to find the 180 grains, what I was able to find was 165 grain Barnes triple shock bullets. And these Barnes triple shock bullets, uh, I wouldn't recommend them for the smaller games like deer. But when it comes to like the real tough hide animals like the moose and the bears, they work absolutely great. The reason is because the copper, it's much harder than lead. So when it comes to mushrooming out, uh, I've had I've taken animals with Barnes triple shock out of my 257 Weatherby, uh, but the deer, it kind of made like almost like a pinhole because it was just going so fast and the bullets are so hard, kind of a thing would be the way I describe it. Uh, the way that they're designed, they have the hole kind of drilled into it, so you kind of get the hydraulic pressure that comes into it, and that's what opens it up. However, it's it's best on the tougher game. With this one here, I shot a bear with it last spring, and it didn't even get out of its footprints. I pulled the trigger, it went straight down, and that's where he was. And with this 300 Win Mag, shooting 165 grain Barnes triple shock, the muzzle velocity is 3,000 feet per second. At 100 yards, it's 2,800. At 200 yards, it's 2,500. 300 yards, 2,300. 400 yards, it's still over 2,000 at 2,100. And then at 500 yards, it's 1,900 feet per second. So it really carries that velocity, shooting the 165 grain, and it also carries the energy out there quite a ways too. At the muzzle, it's 3,400 foot pounds. At 100 yards, it's 2,800. At 200 yards, 2,400. 300 yards, 1,900. 400 yards, it's still over 1,500 foot pounds at 1,600. And then at 500 yards, it's at 1,300. And then the drop in inches too, uh, it's it's not a extremely flat shooting round, but it's flat enough. On here, if you sight in inch and a half high at 100 yards, which is what I typically do, I like that 1 to 1.5 inches high. It'll be dead on at 200 yards, 6 inches low at 300 yards, 20 inches low at 400 yards. And really, on a bear, it's kind of hard to determine the size of a bear. Everybody thinks a big bear is a big bear until they see a big bear. So at 400 yards, you're going to be guessing quite a bit, and you might shoot under them, or you might overcompensate and just fly it right over top. But when it comes to something like an elk or a moose, they have a big target. So if you put this crosshair kind of on the back of an elk, you're gonna hit them at 400 yards if you're proficient at shooting that range. I wouldn't recommend it unless you've done a ton of practice. But anyways, this would be, I'd say, like a 300-yard gun, much like the 30-06. At 300 yards, you're dropping 17 inches, so you're kind of pushing your luck there. So maybe the 30-06 would be like a 200-yard and under gun. This 300 Win Mag would be about 300 yards and under. And that's just for like your everyday shooter. At 300 yards, the animals aren't too small in your scope. The wind, it'll affect it slightly, but not overly too bad. So this is a fully capable round up to 300 yards. With it being a 300 Win Mag, though, you're going to feel it in your shoulder. For a guy like me, I've done a ton of shooting. I'm extremely comfortable. I can shoot a 378 Weatherby more than once, right? And it doesn't really affect me overly too much. But if you're kind of sensitive to, uh, the kick of a gun, the 300 might not be the best one for you. Uh, but when you're shooting at an animal too, you kind of don't really realize what's going on with the kick. There's lots of people that are kind of afraid of the kick of a gun, but when they pull the trigger on an animal, they pretty well say they didn't even notice it. So if you're that kind of a person, 300 can't go wrong. So now moving on from our 300, what we're going to do is we're going to go on to the shotguns. Uh, for me, just because I'm a bit of an oddball character, I absolutely love the 16 gauge shotgun. It's between a 20 gauge and the 12 gauge. So for me, my favorite shotgun round to use on bears is just a 16 gauge shotgun with 2 3/4 inch, the rifled slug on it. And with this one, it's slightly comparable to a 12 gauge. The 12 gauge does have not quite a bit, but it has a bit more oomph to it than the 16 gauge. And I think for the most part, the majority of people are going to use a 12 gauge instead of a 16 gauge. And when you look at the velocity and the energy that comes out of a 16 gauge or even the 12 gauge, it's not impressive whatsoever. If you went just strictly off of ballistic charts, this is one that you would probably never pack. Same thing goes for 12 gauge though. Because even the muzzle velocity, it's 1600 feet per second. And with with these ones, it's kind of funny looking at ballistic charts because you're used to seeing 100 yards, 200, 300. This goes up by increments of 25. So at 25 yards, you drop from 1600 feet per second to 1300. At 50 yards, you're doing 1200. At 75 yards, you're doing 1000. And at 100 yards, you're doing 997 feet per second. The energy at the muzzle, it's only 1989 according to this chart. At 25 yards, you already dropped to 1488. At 50 yards, it's 1100. At 75 yards, it's 910. And at 100 yards, it's only 772 foot-pounds. So if you look at these, you would think that this is not a lethal round. And I would have to agree with you. If somebody just gave me these charts and said, would you shoot a bear with this? I would say absolutely not. However, with that being said, with it being such a wide slug and it's moving so slow, but it's also so heavy, when it hits, it opens right up. And this will go from like ½ inch to almost a 1 inch because it just opens right up. And with all of this weight moving fairly slow, it has a lot of inertia and energy to push it all the way through. And a couple years ago, I actually took my single shot 16 gauge shotgun out. It's a 1921. So for its kind of 100th birthday, I took it out and I shot a bear with it. And I think that bear was I'd say he was about 60 yards away. And it was a double lung shot, went right through and through. He ran about 50 yards, laid down, and lights out. That was it for him. And that was just with this round here. Just a 2 3/4 inch 16 gauge shotgun, rifled slug. I believe these are 7/8 of an ounce. Yeah, 7/8 of an ounce lead slug, and it worked very, very well. And what surprised me was the amount of damage inside that bear when I gutted him out. It made me really think about packing the 16 gauge as an actual bear defense. Even though looking at these these ballistic charts, I wouldn't want to pack this at all. However, seeing the damage that was inside that bear, I would have absolutely no problem using the 16 gauge shotgun again. Uh, with the 16 gauge, it's smaller than a 12 gauge. However, it doesn't mean there's less kick. When you're shooting these slugs, there is so much force coming back at you. It's not for the beginner shooter. I think a lot of people, if they're a beginner shooter and they start with one of these, it's gonna create some problems down the road. They're most likely going to produce a flinch, and then they won't be able to hit the broadside of a barn. Uh, so with the shotgun, it can be fun and it can be rewarding to use. However, with that being said, if you're a new hunter and a new shooter, I wouldn't recommend a shotgun. I would recommend something like the 270s, 280s, 7mm, 30-06 kind of a range. Or if you're completely brand new, 308. Now, moving on from the shotguns, what we're going to be talking about is one of our lever actions here. And with this guy here is the good old 4570. With this round, it's one of the kind of go-to bear brush guns. Lots of guides pack these as backup. With this one here, it has a 325 grain FTX bullet from Hornady, the Lever Revolutions. And with this one here, it's not a long range gun at all. It's very similar to like a shotgun, where even 100 yards might be kind of pushing it just because of the trajectory on these bullets. If you look at the charts, it's just like a boulder. It comes out, it drops right down. With that being said, if you have it sighted in with like a scope, 100 yards you could make it happen. However, it's not necessarily the best. For me, this is just like my bear protection. When I have to go into thick brush and look for a wounded bear, I pack this with my Marlin guide gun, holds 5 in the tube, open sights, and it's basically 50 yards and under type of a rifle. The ballistics, though, however, they're pretty promising with the 325 grain bullets. The muzzle velocity is 2,000 feet per second. At 100 yards, it's 1,700. 200 yards, it's 1,400. 300 yards, it's 1,200. The energy at the muzzle is 3,000 foot-pounds. At 100 yards, it's 2,100. 200 yards, it's 1,500. 300 yards, it's 1,000. And then the trajectory, though, at the muzzle, negative 1.5, and that's if you sight it in 5.5 inches high at 100 yards. And then at 200 yards, it's 0. 300 yards, it's pretty well 2 feet low. It says 23 inches low. With these FTX bullets, they have this nice little ballistic tip there that has a dual purpose. So this is so when it's inside a tubular magazine, this rubber tip, it sits like this on the next one. So that way the shock of the gun when you're firing, the potential of this striking the firing pin and creating a chain reaction is extremely, extremely small. Also, when you fire this and that bullet comes out and it makes contact, what happens is this outside edge right here, there's these little cuts on the outside of the copper. They're kind of like grooves. So what happens is this red tip makes contact, it inserts itself into the copper, these petals start to open up, and this bullet goes from 0.450 of an inch, being 45 caliber. Once those petals start to open up, it's kind of like a shotgun slug where it almost gets to be about 1 inch. So it opens right up very fast, doesn't take much force because of the little grooves that are all cut in here. So as soon as this makes contact, it opens right up and it creates a giant wound channel. And it is absolutely devastating on bears. I took one that was on a hill walking towards me with its head down. I shot it kind of at the base of the neck, and the amount of shock that went through that bear's body, pretty well about a foot down from the front quarters and up, was basically just bloodshot. Uh, it was just devastating on that bear. One thing with the 4572 is the amount of bullet selection that you have for it. It's there's not much. However, the range is huge. You can go from, I believe it's 200 grain, maybe 250 grain, all the way up to some specialty ammo. I want to say it's 500 grain bullets. Don't quote me on that one, but you can get some extremely heavy loads out of a 4570. But in all honesty, I don't think you need it. I've seen what this 325 grain bullet does, and really, I think this is plenty powerful for pretty well anything in North America, up close and personal. For long range, I I wouldn't even attempt it. I shot at a target once at 100 yards just to see what would happen, and with open sights, the bead took up the entire target. I said, what the heck? Pulled the trigger, and it was feet in front of the target that the dust flew. So, yeah, this one here, if you're 50 yards and closer, it's absolutely devastating. And I would highly recommend it for anybody going after a wounded bear. So the 4570, it makes a excellent bear caliber if you're 50 yards and closer. Other than that, you might be able to push it to 75 yards, and then also that's with open sights. If you have a scope, 100 yards, you'll be okay, but I wouldn't really push it much further than that. It has the energy, but it's just the drop. It's so big that it would be very, very hard to hit accurately with this round. Now, I know I said I was going to go over 5, but we have an honorable mention here at the end here, specifically for lever actions, and it is the good old-fashioned 30-30. Now, I want to bring this one up because a lot of people say the 243, it's too small for any big game. Some people say it's a deer and coyote round. It's too small for elk and moose and especially bears. However, this little guy here, the old 30-30, has probably put more meat on the table than almost all these guys combined. And the 30-30, this one here, it's loaded with some of these new Lever Revolutions, 160 grain FTX bullets. It's the same kind of design that the 4570 has. And with these, with these new bullets, it takes this thing and it puts it on steroids. The 30-30, it has put hundreds of thousands of meals on the table for a lot of people for a lot of years using the old school primers and bullets and powders and all that stuff. And this new age stuff, according to these boxes and all the ballistic guys out there, they say something like these Lever Evolutions and the powders that they use, you can get up to 40% more energy than the traditional loads. So with that, you already have an advantage over the old school stuff. So I wouldn't look past the 30-30. Even the ballistics, they are very, very similar to the 243. The 30-30 used in this round, the 160 grain FTX, the velocity is 2,400 feet per second. At 100 yards, it's 2,150. 200 yards is 1,900. 300 yards, 1,700. And then the energy at the muzzle, it's 2,000 foot-pounds. At 100 yards, it's 1,600. 200 yards, 1,300. 300 yards, 1,000. And even the trajectory there, it's not that bad. If you're 3 inches high at 100 yards, you'll be 0 at 200 yards, and you'll be a foot low at 300 yards. Compare that to the 243. Muzzle velocity, it's slightly better with the 243 at 2800 compared to the 3030 at 24. The energy, 3030 wins. It's 1800 on the 243, whereas the 3030 it's 2000. At 100 yards, it's 1500 on the 243, 1600 with the 3030, and at 300 yards, that's where we start to kind of get neck and neck, where the energy is 1045 on the 243 and it's 1025 with the 3030. But with that being said, again, these rounds aren't meant for 300 or 400 yard shots. You know, the 3030 and the 243, they're honestly 150 to 200 yards and under kind of guns, if you're being honest with yourself. There's a lot of people that'll say, you know, they can shoot whatever at some astronomical number with the 243. Sure, you can, but to me, that's unethical. But with this 3030, a lot of people, again, they'll say it's too small for bears. But when you look back in the history books, there has been so many bears taken with this 3030. And honestly, if you can take a bear with a 3030, you can take a bear with a 243. And even the size comparison, if you stand them side by side, they're almost the same length. You might be able to get a little bit more powder out of the 243. The bullets are a little bit smaller than the 3030, so the wound channel at first might be a bit smaller, but you know, they're both just extremely capable rounds. So don't let anybody tell you that a smaller round won't work. What it comes down to, though, is your bullet selection and your shot placement, and that comes for pretty well every round. You can shoot a cannon at a bear, but if you shoot him in the foot, you know, you're just gonna take a foot off the bear, right? So that all being said, I think the majority of times, the absolute best caliber for any bear in North America, minus grizzlies because they're a bit tougher than blacks, is basically the gun that you're comfortable with. If you shoot a 30-06, take a 30-06. If you shoot a 243, take your 243. If you shoot a 338 Win Mag, take your 338. If you're looking at trying something new and you want like an excellent all-around caliber, buy a 308. The caliber or the bullet selection that you can get from a 308 is huge because the 30 caliber, I believe the 308 you can get anywhere from like 100 grain up to 200 grain bullets. So you know, if you just like to experiment and try new calibers, you know, pick up 308. Plus, you can use it. Your kid can use it. Your wife can use it. Your grandma can use it. Your grandpa can use it. You know, it's a great all-around caliber. But with that all being said here, guys, that's kind of my 2 cents on calibers for bears. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button down in the bottom. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you guys pack for a rifle. And, yeah, subscribe to the channel. We'll see you on the next one.